How can government policy be more family-friendly? Can socialism exist without coercion? And how did bad monetary policy encourage DEI and ESG? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of eConception. eConception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and the broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from a middle-class neighborhood in the 1950s, where absolutely everyone is happy, except for the mothers who are taking drugs, the children who don't see their fathers, and the black people and the immigrants who weren't allowed in. What does it mean to be pro-family in the current economy? I think there's a lot of talk, especially online and especially on the political right, about what the right family structure is, what that means for the future, and exactly how government should be involved in promoting or discouraging certain activities that will harm or help family formation. One of those issues is oftentimes a misplaced nostalgia for things that never really existed. But there are things that policy can do to be more family friendly. So in order to talk about those issues, the difference between them, and what pro-family policy really should look like, I have Susannah Petitt. She is a social mobility fellow with Young Voices and a program manager at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And she has a great new piece out on the Young Voices Substack called What Does It Mean to Be Pro-Family? Thanks for being with us, Susannah.
Thanks for having me, Dominic.
So I guess to start off, one of the statistics that you have right away in the piece is that about 25% of kids in the U.S. live in households with a stay-at-home mom. And so I think for some people, they might view that as like the ideal family, that you should have a stay-at-home mom. But 75% of kids in the U.S. don't have that right now. Is that a problem?
It kind of depends on who you talk to, right? So a lot of people believe that that's a problem. They won't say it explicitly, but you see it in their rhetoric. You know, at the NatCon conference in 2022, there was a speaker who described working moms as medicated, meddlesome, and quarrelsome women. And so if that's the way you talk about women who decide to work outside the home, then you probably see a problem with the idea that women maybe would prefer to work outside the home. But generally, you don't see a lot of differences in kind of child outcomes from having mothers who work outside the home. And I think that's kind of the best way that we should assess if working outside the home for mothers is good is if it's good for children. And you don't see these sort of developmental differences, social differences. The only data that points to that is when children are very, very young, which is usually when women do take time off, is when their baby is under a few months old. And that's just because of parent or mother-child bonding. So the data doesn't point to that there being anything wrong with women working outside the home, but some believe that there is both economic and social consequences from the idea of not having a stay-at-home mother. But clearly the majority of people choose to work, or the majority of families choose to have both parents working outside the home.
Is both parents working some kind of a modern problem? Because there's a very common trope. It started with Elizabeth Warren on the left, and it has migrated over to the right, and it's called the two-income trap. This idea that two parents have to work because of the greedy capitalists, and before the greedy capitalists took over in the 1980s, it was easy to have one parent work and the other one stay home, and everybody was happier. I'm not being extremely charitable in my description of that, but what do you make of that idea? And maybe you can put it a little bit nicer than I did.
Yeah, you're right about the two-income trap, that it started with Elizabeth Warren, and actually her daughter. They wrote a book where they talk about the two-income trap because women working used to be considered a form of, for lack of a better word, insurance for families who, if, say, their husband got laid off and the woman had a degree, she could go into the workforce. Or if they had some sort of major cost the woman could go into work. But the argument holds that women who, or as prices have gotten higher, this insurance policy has just become the norm, that everything is so expensive that women need to work outside the home. And for the national conservatives who promote this idea, which is not for her credit, which not usually want to give it to Elizabeth Warren, but this is not what she argues is the two income trap. She definitely focuses more on bankruptcy, that it'll lead to, this two income trap leads to more families just completely running out of money. But national conservatives don't focus on that part. They don't focus on the true economic and financial consequences. They more see it as this two income trap is the reason marriage has become less appealing. So women no longer see men as purely a financial means and now want to get married for, love or whatever. And instead they see marriage as, because it's no longer offering this financial security and it's become more expensive to get married, families are just opting out of it. So obviously, if there's no financial purpose to get married, why would women choose it, is kind of the argument that they make. And all of this roots back to women entering the workforce. So they kind of twist what Elizabeth Warren originally put forth, which is, a valid point about how families maybe organize their lives, right? Like if you, especially when it comes to the 2008, I believe she was writing it about the 2008 crisis. And she points out that families were kind of using this insurance policy. And so that to me makes a little bit more sense than the idea that, well, families have fallen into this, it's too expensive, so they won't get married. But conservatives aren't thinking about the true economic data that, as I said, for her credit, does support some of what Elizabeth Warren put forth.
And it's kind of a weird paradox that the people who talk the most about traditional values and sort of downplaying economists' research and data and that focus, they're also the ones, though, that, like you said, are making this extremely economistic argument about marriage, which is that marriage is something that you only do if it's financially advantageous to you. It seems like something, you could imagine George Stigler writing a paper about that.
Yeah, it feels very warped. The idea that marrying for love is almost like a bad thing just feels so anti-conservative. And it really is a privilege, especially for women, to be able to marry for love and to be able to say, I don't need a husband for financial support. Like I can go open a credit card, which wasn't true of women in the 60s. And it's bizarre that conservatives aren't kind of championing this idea that these movements and women's economic empowerment have allowed us to have families that love each other. It's just a very not at all conservative viewpoint. So completely agree with you. Definitely more of a Stigler talking point.
Yeah, and one of the things that some conservatives have been promoting, though, is this idea of the trad wife, which you talk about in your post. You give the example of Ballerina Farm, which is this influencer family where the mother of has, I think, nine children, is it?
It's a lot.
A large number.
And I think she's pregnant again. Yeah. There's a lot.
So she has a lot of
going
kids and she stays home and does stuff. But the sort of underlying current to their success online, first of all, is that it's online. So not exactly traditional. But second, that they're really, really rich. And so, if you're really, really rich, you can afford to do lots of things, including creating a sort of traditional lifestyle brand. But what was it actually like for people in the past that lived this kind of lifestyle?
Not what you see Ballerina Farm. And I also give the example of Nara Smith, who's another kind of not NatCon, like trad wife archetype. And for Ballerina Farm, she has millions of followers and her husband is the son of the founder of JetBlue. So they're millionaires. And so they have the ability to kind of go homestead and run a small business where they sell sourdough starters and flour and beef. And that's great. That's capitalism at work that they're able to do that. But that wasn't what it was like for families in the 50s. You hear a lot about kind of the mommy's little helper pills where mothers were generally very unhappy to be staying at home and felt dissatisfied with their arrangement. And families were overworked. There weren't good relationships between fathers and their children. And it just isn't the world families or NatCons want or seem to describe for the families. So it isn't the woman in a pretty dress being happily married, raising her children, baking cookies for her husband, and her husband comes home at 5 p.m. every day and is doting on his wife and children. That just isn't what the data and what personal experiences of former trad wives in the 50s and 60s describe it as. And of course, there's also the element of like, this is only what white families were experiencing. Like, this isn't for anyone else, where no one else was experiencing this kind of lifestyle. And these families were poor. They did not have access to a lot of the conveniences that you kind of start to expect early on in your marriage. Like, 2 cars would be an anomaly. The, having an iPhone would be something that would be reserved for, obviously it didn't exist back then, but any sort of innovative technology would not be accessible to the middle and lower classes.
They didn't have air conditioning.
Right, exactly. And personally, I would rather not live in a house without air conditioning. And even I live in a house right now that was built in the 40s and we have AC. And so I would rather live in it now than live in it in the 50s.
For sure. One of the policy solutions that people come up with for family formation, because it is true that, there are far more kids born outside of marriage, far more kids being raised by single parents than there were in the past. And there's all sorts of negative you said that there really aren't very many negative outcomes for people with a working mother and father, but there are negative outcomes for people that only have one parent in their lives. It's clearly better for children to have both, on average anyway. And so people will be concerned about this. And so one of the solutions is that we need to spend more money. The federal government needs to subsidize families, because that is actually using, economic reasoning, right? If you want more of something, subsidize it. So is that the right path, or what's missing there?
There's a lot missing there. I think the main point is that these costs that government are rightfully concerned about, and you're right, that for children who live in a 2-parent household, Melissa Carney wrote a great book on how it's a privilege to have 2 parents. They have better educational outcomes, are less likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. They're happier, all the benefits go on and on. But the costs that governments talk about, these raising costs, are largely being driven by intentional choices of the government to regulate what families need. And so then they decide to spend taxpayer dollars to overcome regulatory costs. It's just weirdly cyclical. And so instead of focusing on why families maybe are facing such extreme costs, they're willing to just throw money at the problem instead of, again, looking at, okay, what is driving these costs up? And that's looking at why families are struggling when they get married. And, you see a lot of people pointing to these welfare queens, or women who are remaining on welfare, have children, aren't getting married. But our welfare phase in and phase out programs are so extreme. So there was a study by the Atlanta Fed that found that a single mother in DC would make no gains financially, as her earnings went from $11,000 to $65,000 because of how our benefits phase out. So her choosing to stay on welfare is actually doing what makes the most sense economically. Even if we don't like it, right? That she's doing what's best for her kids by staying on welfare, because the system makes it so it's not economically advantageous to leave welfare. So just creating a new sort of entitlement welfare program doesn't actually address why families might not be getting married, and how government has contributed to that problem.
And I think there's a kind of ugly double standard there too, which is that for the wealthier families, it's considered a positive thing for the mother to be staying home and not working. But then for poorer families, it's she needs to go to work, and because she's getting these welfare benefits and therefore should go to work. But like you said, 9 times out of 10, she's actually making the smart economic decision by not going to work. And that's not her fault. That's the government's fault for creating the welfare programs and setting them up that way.
Right, exactly. Like, if you are going to make more money and be able to afford food and diapers for your kids, if you don't go to work and don't get married, it is rational to make the decision to not go to work and not get married. And then we, give money we tie these sort of baby bonds, these income credits, these tax credits to employment, to working. And so it ends up just being a government grant of special privilege to the wealthy classes and saying, hey, you engaged in a behavior that we think is desirable and you got married and you had kids, here's a handout. And that shouldn't be the families that we're focused on. The wealthier families can afford food, can afford childcare. And we just kind of look down on women who are making an economically rational decision for them and their kids.
So what about the child tax credit? Child tax credit's been around for a while. It started in the 90s as sort of part of a broader package of tax cuts, and then has sort of become this idea that it's supposed to promote fertility. I've looked into the history of this a little bit. That wasn't the original point of the child tax credit. It was a lot of the arguments for the child tax credit that were actually made by policymakers are more along the lines of making the benefit system in the U.S. more fair, because we have lots and lots of benefits for old people and we don't have very many benefits for young people. And so the solution was to create more benefits for young people, even though I think the better solution would be to just have less benefits for old people. But the child tax credit was not supposed to be something to promote fertility originally as it was designed, but has sort of become that in the minds of a lot of people, and they sort of want to turn it into that. Do you think there's any chance of that actually working?
No. Just simply put, no. There's some evidence that says it could create larger families, but at best, the child tax credit would encourage families who were already deciding to have children earlier. So my husband and I want to have kids, right? If they boost the child tax credit to, we'll just say like a crazy number, like $20,000, right? We would have children right away, because then we get to take advantage of those benefits. But it does nothing to change the minds of people who wouldn't have otherwise had children. My husband and I having our first child earlier than we planned really doesn't do anything to change the birth rate, besides the year that the birth rate goes up. And so that's not really a sustainable increase in fertility rates. And there are some studies that point to that, like, exposure to these tax credits in childhood might actually delay marriage and first births for women. I think that data was about the earned income tax credit, but you can kind of suspect that there would be similar patterns with the child tax credit. So that means that we're just kind of kicking the can of the birth dearth down the line, where women maybe today have more children, but then as their children get exposed to this treatment, they maybe won't have children themselves.
So conservatives used to talk a lot about something called the success sequence, which was the idea that you need to graduate high school, not college, graduate high school, get married, and then have children. And if you do those things in that order, you're very, very likely to have a stable middle-class life. You're very likely to stay in that marriage for a long time. You're very likely to be able to take care of your kids and provide for them. And so that this is a really good sort of pattern to follow as sort of a rule of thumb in policymaking. And one of the things that seems to suggest that is true is that in the United States, married couples with children, that category of family, two married parents that have children, their median income, so not the average, it's the median, it's the true middle person, their median income is about $120,000 a year. That does not strike me as an especially sympathetic case for more government spending, people making $120,000 a year. These are probably not people whose primary needs are needing more money from the federal government. And they're the ones who have children. The conclusion you can draw from that then is that child tax credits, at least as far as I can tell, are really going to encourage more people to have children outside of marriage, because they're the ones who probably are most financially sensitive to these things compared to people that are making $120,000 a year. If conservatives are supposed to be prioritizing marriage and promoting that, it seems like the child tax credit causes some problems there that could, perpetuate the trend that we've seen in the last several decades away from marriage and towards more single parenthood.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a risk that we would take. Some politicians have talked about wanting to tie it so that it only goes to married couples, but then you have the same problem, right? Like the married couples are set up for success. I think there was an AEI study that talked about how like 95, 97% of millennials that follow the success sequence are not in poverty by the time they reach prime adult age, right? These treatment effects these treatments aren't focused on the groups we want them to focus on. So there definitely is a risk that people will just kind of start having children, especially those in destitute poverty, but then they're not being raised by two parents. They maybe don't have a stable home. It will just kind of perpetuate the cycle of poverty. It'll do very little for helping poor children, which should be the goal.
So we've talked a lot about what the government can't do, which is a very important theme on this podcast. But what are some things that government can do instead that would actually help families?
Yeah, so I give 3 ideas in the Substack piece that you mentioned that I wrote for Young Voices. The first is zoning reform. There has been a huge missing starter home in recent years. I live in Falls Church, Virginia. There's a lot of what used to be starter homes that have gotten built up. So they've taken like a tiny Cape Cod house and have built 2 or 3 stories on top of it to make it into kind of a warped mega mansion. But then that puts it out of reach when couples want to sell it or families want to sell their homes. Eventually that puts it out of reach for younger couples. And so there is just a huge dearth of starter homes. And these do have real consequences for fertility. The getting housing increases the probability of having children by about 4%, but strict zoning codes reduce fertility rate for women in their 20s and then also lead them to delay birth by 3 to 4 years. So these have very real consequences, but less strict zoning codes that allow for townhomes, duplexes, kind of this missing middle that people talk about would do a lot to help families move out of their 1-bedroom apartment. And it makes sense, right? You live in a 1-bedroom apartment with your partner and you think to yourself, where would we even put children in this apartment? So we will delay until we make more money. But if housing gets cheaper, you can see families pushing their age at first birth up. And so they're having children younger, which means they're more likely to have more children in the future. The second thing I point to is flexible work. So protections for the gig economy. And then this is also something that can be done in the private sector too, of firms recognizing that families benefit, especially benefit from flexible work. And you see this during COVID. Fertility rates for women under 25 rose because they felt like they had more time for those life changes from pregnancy and a new baby. And you see this in Germany. You see there was a study by the Economic Innovation Group that found the same thing in the US. There's just a lot of data that points to flexible work increasing fertility and helping families balance the obligations of work and home. And some of that is the gig economy. And the federal government can do more to protect independent contractors who are a lot of which are women and women mothers or female mothers. Well, I guess female are always mothers. But then finally, we have the final thing I talk about is reducing grocery prices. And something that really frustrates me right now is we have this huge push to make America healthy again, while then also taxing Mexico, which provides most of our healthy food. The majority of our fruits and vegetables come from Mexico, and slapping a 25% tariff on fruits and vegetables is just a tax on the poor. Point blank, like richer families can absorb that cost. Poor families can't. There's data that says that when incomes are constrained, poor families, the first thing they give up is healthier food options. So if we want families to have access to good food, we need to have less less import barriers and less regulatory barriers. We saw that when there was the baby formula crisis, that we couldn't import baby formula from Europe because it had like one ingredient different than what was approved by the FDA. And so children were starving. This is not how we should create family-friendly policy. And we should have family-friendly policy in the US, but it shouldn't be through more subsidies, more tariffs. That's all just flying in the face of a pro-family agenda.
Yeah, the baby formula episode was so illustrative of a lot of these different things because it's basically an entirely domestic market for baby formula. We basically through import barriers, through labeling regulations, through all sorts of different things, we basically prevent any foreign formula from coming into the United States. So it's all domestically produced, which should be a good thing. If the theory of tariffs and the theory of the superiority of domestic manufacturing is true, the baby formula market should be amazing. It should be perfectly resilient. It should never run out of anything because we make it all in America. And it turns out that it's actually really bad to put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, and that there's actually wisdom in diversifying supply from different countries so that if there's a problem in one country, you can just buy stuff from another one and you don't have to worry about some of this stuff. The other thing about the baby formula is that it is subsidized heavily by the government through the WIC program, which has been expanded and expanded and expanded to the point where now it's nearly a middle class program for a lot of people. And a majority of baby formula sold in the United States is subsidized through the WIC program. So this should be the model for affordability. If the answer is more government spending for families, baby formula should be extremely affordable. Everyone should be able to access it. And yet, what do we see? Constant random shortages, high prices all the time. And then that just fuels even more calls for even more subsidies to make up for it. It's a classic illustration of exactly these issues. And we still don't seem to have quite learned the lesson from it.
Yeah, that goes back to what I said earlier, that the costs families face are driven by government. And so just giving subsidies to address these government instituted barriers to families thriving is so stupidly cyclical when it ends up just making our fiscal situation worse. We don't have money to pay for these policies. And then it's inflationary and it just keeps burdening the lower classes with higher inflation rates and weird subsidies that make our welfare system even more complicated and harder to navigate. And it does nothing to actually help boost our birth rate, have families get married, have families move up the social ladder. You don't see any of the purported benefits that policymakers say will come from just one more subsidy.
Yeah, it's always just one more subsidy, and maybe at some point we'll figure out that one less subsidy would probably be a better course of action. Thanks so much for talking to us, Susannah.
Yeah, thank you.
Socialists usually get uncomfortable when confronted with real-life socialist governments. And part of the reason for that is that they just have a terrible track record. Look at the Soviet Union. You can look at China. You can look at Cuba. It's not a pretty picture. But I think part of the uncomfortableness comes from thinking that socialism means something that it doesn't mean. That word social in socialism is usually a nice word, right? If you describe someone as being social, that's usually positive aspect. Antisocial is considered a bad thing. It's good for people to be able to relate to one another. It's good for people to spend time with other people. We don't want people to be lonely and isolated. And so society, social, that's usually a positive image. But socialism, as we've seen from those real world examples, is not a positive image. But people still want to claim that it is. Because a lot of times when people say that they like socialism, what they mean is that they like some kind of social democracy. Think about countries like in Scandinavia, places in Europe that have a much deeper social democratic tradition than the United States does. That's certainly true. And those countries are not terrible, repressive, poor countries. They're some of the richest countries in the world. They're generally decent places to live. And you don't have to worry about the government disappearing you in the middle of the night. But it's really important, I think, to narrow in on what socialism really means, which is an alternative to markets for organizing economic activity. Those social democratic countries in Europe, they have markets. They use markets all the time. There's all sorts of regulations and government spending and welfare programs that get in the way of markets in those places, but they have markets. Famously, many of them have very free trade systems. Denmark, Sweden are two of the most trade-friendly countries in the world. They have extremely low barriers for imports, very low tariffs, and they have for a very long time because they realize that that's helpful to them as a small economy to be open to the rest of the world. You can look at things like economic freedom ratings from the Heritage Foundation, from the Cato Institute, from Fraser Institute, from, any of the organizations that put those things out. And oftentimes those countries like Sweden will sometimes rank higher than the United States for economic freedom. Because even though they have a much larger welfare state than the United States does, even though they have this social democratic tradition, they actually understand that markets are necessary for their national prosperity. And a lot of times they have much more liberal, in the old sense of that word, meaning free, trade regimes, and so on. But socialism doesn't mean that. Socialism is an alternative to markets for organizing economic activity. It's based on the idea that property should be publicly owned. It should be collectively owned. It says that private property rights are not the important thing that we believe that they are if you support markets. They're actually a problem. And in order to fix that problem, we need to nationalize industries. We need to collectivize ownership. And then the decisions about how that property gets used will get made by government planners. And they are supposed to do so in a way that will be superior to markets. Because socialists look at the market system and they say, look at all this waste. They look at things like venture capital, where 8 or 9 out of 10 projects fail. And they say, why are we wasting money on all this stuff that fails? If we just got the money together and we put smart people in charge, they would still make some mistakes, but they wouldn't fail 80, 90% of the time. That's crazy. And sure, maybe we wouldn't have some of the exceptions that prove to be really great, but we could at least guarantee a more stable existence for the vast majority of people. And we wouldn't have to worry about those greedy capitalists wasting our money. One of the other forms that this argument takes is says that things like advertising it's just waste. That we spend all of this money not actually making stuff, but by trying to tell people to buy stuff. We wouldn't have to do that if the government just directed how this stuff would go. And so the socialist argument is one actually based on efficiency. This is true historically if you look back, especially in the late 1800s and early 1900s, when a lot of academics were coming up with these ideas about socialism. And then you had guys like Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek who were arguing against these guys. And they were saying, no, you don't understand. The alternatives to markets are going to be worse. They're going to be worse. It's true that markets are a trial and error process. And there's lots of error. There's lots of mistakes. But it's only from making those mistakes, it's only from going through that process that you get any of the great advances for human prosperity. They were largely ignored. And all over the world, people have tried to institute socialist government, to institute socialist economic planning. Economic planning that says private property is not that important. Public ownership of property is better. And the government can direct production for the benefit of everyone. It turns out that when you give government that kind of power, it attracts really terrible people who want to exercise that power. Think about the nicest people you know in your life. How many of them really, really want large amounts of political power? I'm going to say it's probably not very many. Usually, really nice people are the kind of people who want to lay low. They don't want to be the center of attention. They don't want to be the one who everyone is asking for favors or blaming when things go wrong. They're usually the kind of people who want to serve others. They're a great member of their community, but they understand that they're a member of their community and they are not the community itself. And they usually, if they are in a leadership position, they usually have to be asked to take it. And they'll usually decline the first time. And only after they realize, oh, these people really think I'm the best person for this, do they take it. I'm sure we all know people like that in our personal lives. If you had a socialist government system, those are the kind of people you would want to be doing the government planning. But like I said, for all sorts of reasons, they're not going to do it. The people who really like using that kind of power are not nice people. This is what Hayek was talking about in his book Road to Serfdom when he said, the worst get on top. It's a chapter title in the book. And his point is that if you create a system with that kind of power and that kind of incentives, the people who are going to respond most strongly are bad people who want to use power, who like using power, and who will, if given the opportunity, do really terrible things. I bring this up because it's relevant to the experience of Venezuela. There was an article in the New York Times recently talking about Americans who were unjustly imprisoned in Venezuela and were recently freed. It's great that these people have come back, and it's great that they can talk about their awful treatment. The details are absolutely horrifying. Some of them were handcuffed with devices that had spikes on their wrists. The prison was run by a guy named Shark. The building itself is basically falling apart. People were stripped naked, beaten, bags over their heads. Awful, awful stuff. But the New York Times could not bring itself to say what type of government they have in Venezuela. Now, they said it has an autocratic government, which it does. They said that Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, is an autocrat, which he is. But they couldn't bring themselves to say that Venezuela is a socialist government, which it does. Maduro is the leader of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. He and his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, collectivized Venezuelan industries, seized private property from individuals, and took it over for the state in order to plan. And this was supposed to be for the good of the people. And it's ended up with prisons where foreigners are taken hostage and then used as bargaining chips by the government with foreign countries. Not to mention all of the Venezuelans who have been captured, tortured, imprisoned, and in some cases killed because they happen to disagree with the socialist government. Because you see, it's a funny thing that happens if the government is just acting on behalf of the people. If collectivized ownership and nationalization is what the people want, then anyone who disagrees is contrary to the will of the people. You can't disagree with the people. Come on. Of course, that whole concept is manufactured. If you had told people when they first voted for Hugo Chavez that this is what was going to happen. If they had an actual picture of what was going to happen ahead of time, they probably would have chosen differently. But this kind of stuff is not an accident in socialism. It's not some like unfortunate side effect that like, oh no, these bad people took over and they're doing terrible things. They took over because they created a system in which government is extremely powerful. A government that has the power to take property from private individuals and to direct all economic production in central planning is a government that also has the power to run prisons where they torture people for no reason. You can't have one without the other. It's not an accident that this always happens in socialist countries. You can't separate out the economic from the political in the way that you might like to. When you have a political program that's based fundamentally on taking stuff from some people and giving it to other people, or rather, taking stuff from some people and putting it under government control. The people who are doing the taking are not going to be nice people. And if the people who are getting taken from disagree or dissent, they're going to have to be put down some way. It'll start off probably nicely. There'll be slogans and political campaigns to try to convince people to give up their property. That'll work for some people. But then there will be some people who are left, who are still like, you know what, this isn't for me. And the socialist program doesn't work unless the government controls everything. And so, this isn't really for me, isn't an excuse that flies in a socialist system. The government has to come in and stop you. And they do. And it's terrible. So it's important to keep in mind the reason that Sweden, Denmark, places like that are decent places to live is not because they have socialist governments. They have markets. In many cases, they have markets that are freer in some respects than ours are in the United States. That's why they're successful. Economically, anyway. And if they actually took socialism seriously in those places, if they actually had collective ownership of property, if they actually had all nationalized industries, if they actually had the government centrally planning economic production for the whole country, bad people in Denmark and Sweden would be attracted to those positions, and they would start having a lot of the same problems that they do in Venezuela. It wouldn't look like that right away, but it would get there eventually. Because it's inherent to socialism. It's inherent to a strong government that has that kind of power, that it will use it poorly. So, socialism cannot exist without coercion. Now let's talk about a milder battle of capitalism, which is against bad monetary policy from the Federal Reserve. Nowhere near the scale of problems that they have in socialist countries. But we are seeing a sort of resurgence in capitalism in the United States as companies get away from diversity initiatives and ESG investing, socially responsible investing, that sort of thing, becomes less fashionable. Why did this happen? One thing that seems to be a big deal is that Donald Trump won the 2024 presidential election despite many people not expecting him to, and that he won in such a way that he received the most votes in the popular vote, which people really were not expecting. And that this seemed to be a major blow to progressivism in the culture, because Joe Biden ran a very progressive administration and Kamala Harris ran as a pretty progressive candidate. It seemed that progressivism was becoming more culturally dominant in the last couple of years, and then Trump's election seemed to say that the pendulum was swinging back the other way. But the timeline doesn't quite match up. My friend Russ Green wrote a piece for the Free Press where he talked about the timing that private companies got away from their DEI and ESG initiatives. And the timing seems to suggest it was actually earlier than 2024. It was even earlier than Donald Trump's having won the Republican nomination for president before the primaries. It was all the way back in 2022. Green points out that the number of times that DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion were mentioned in earnings calls by companies peaked in 2021 in the second quarter and then was falling in 2022. Spending by corporations on DEI jobs started to fall in 2022. Outlets like CNBC were already reporting on big tech's retreat from DEI in late 2023. So it was already kind of an accepted fact that this was happening before it was even the election year. How about ESG investing? Green says that 2022 also was the pivot point for ESG. The S&P Global Clean Energy Index lost roughly half of its value from the beginning of 2022 to the beginning of this year. And over that same span, the S&P 500 went up almost 30%. And ESG funds did the opposite of what you'd expect if you thought that presidential politics was guiding their decision-making. American ESG funds saw large inflows between 2019 and 2021, Green says, which was the end of Trump's administration and the first couple months of Biden's. Then there was minimal change in 2022, and then in 2023 and 2024, you saw funds flowing out of ESG investing. Green says that this decline occurred despite a Biden administration eager to encourage sustainable investing and despite major legislation designed to encourage the transition to green energy. So this is another case of thing I've talked about before, which is that presidents don't really control the economy. If presidents controlled the economy, the Biden years should have been top ESG years. But instead, for the second half of his presidency, we saw people pulling money out of those funds. Why? Because they weren't doing very well. Because what actually motivates people to make decisions on the market is profit and loss, not who the president is. But it raises the question, what happened in 2022? Why did this stuff happen in 2022? Well, Green's answer, and I think there's a lot to recommend it, is that it's when the Federal Reserve started to raise interest rates. We mentioned Hayek earlier on the podcast. A different area of Hayek's thought is about what's called Austrian business cycle theory, which is the idea that business cycles are in large part caused by malinvestment or bad investment. And what encourages bad investment? Low interest rates. If interest rates are really low and you can borrow money basically for nothing, you don't care as much about whether the investment is any good, because even if it only makes a 1% return, if you borrow it at 0%, 1% return is just fine. In addition, if you lose money on it, it's okay, because you can borrow money for free. What do you care if the investments fail? This is like a little mini version of Austrian business cycle theory, in that it wasn't really the whole business cycle that was being affected. There wasn't a recession over this. But it was the very small industry that sprung up in the last couple of years around diversity initiatives and sustainable investing. The sustainable investing piece is actually pretty big. the diversity industry was big in terms of its growth rate, but in general, it's not that big. You got to remember the United States economy is about $27 trillion. So when you see, universities or companies spending several $1 million on these things, it might be a lot for them, but in general in the economy, it's actually not that much. But why did companies stop doing this with interest rates? Green puts it this way. He said, when money is free, crazy ideas get funded. When money has a price, funders and investors want to see a direct link to value. That means ideological pet projects are the first to go. The way I put it is, when money stops being free, you have to actually start making money. For about 15 years, we had extremely low interest rates. They were either zero or very close to zero. From 2010 until late 2016, early 2017, they were basically zero. Then they came up a little bit. Then the Fed changed its mind in 2019 and it started cutting again. And then they were back at zero during COVID. Then inflation got out of control. And the Fed really started raising rates in 2022. And they remain at a higher level than they ever were at any point in the past 15 years. Now, it's important to say that historically speaking, interest rates are not that high. They've been much higher in the past. But relative to the past 15 years, they are high. The past 15 years was sort of the 4,000-year low point in interest rates, as Jim Grant likes to say. So we shouldn't make that our frame for normal. But yeah, once you can no longer borrow money for free, there's actual consequences to losing money. Easy money from the Federal Reserve is a subsidy for all kinds of bad ideas. Really, it's a subsidy for failure. Or it's a subsidy for stuff that just isn't that productive or useful. ESG investing falls into a similar conceit as socialism. The idea that if we just get smart people together, they can plan things better than the markets could. Now, ESG is not socialism because it says it decides it wants to try to use markets in order to do that. So it's a different thing in that sense. It does not believe in collectivized ownership by the government, but it does have a similar pattern of thought, which is that markets, they don't really know what they're doing. We need to get the smart people in to fix them. And that doesn't work. ESG was sort of branded as a way to do well by doing good. And turns out, whether they were doing good or not is up for debate. But the doing well part did not pan out. Like we said before, ESG funds started doing much worse than the S&P 500. And all this is a lot of the reason this has come crashing down is because interest rates have returned. Because interest rates are really just a reflection of a simple fact, which is that people would rather have $1 today than $1 a year from now. You have the choice between $1 right now and $1 1 year from today. You're going to take the $1 right now every time. This is basically true across the board. And so interest rates are just a reflection of that fact. And they say, well, because of that preference that people have, you have to charge a little bit in order to make up the difference. Or from the lender's point of view, you have to receive a little bit to make up the difference. Holding interest rates down at zero required trillions and trillions of dollars worth of open market operations by central banks in order to suppress that simple fact of life, that people would rather have $1 now than $1 a year from now, and that the interest rate is a reflection of that reality. So when you deny reality, you end up in some funny places. What we're seeing now is a return to reality where money has a price, where you can't get away with these ideological projects anymore because there's actual financial consequences for it. And ultimately, that's what makes decisions happen in the real economy. It's not primarily about who the president is, who controls Congress, what laws they write. All that stuff is important, but when push comes to shove, it's the dollars and cents that usually do the talking. Now it's time for the paper of the episode, but before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. Helps us to know that you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. I let Susannah pick the paper of the episode from the American Economic Review in December of 2023 by Manuel Funke, Moritz Schularik, and Christoph Trebisch, Populist Leaders and the Economy. Here's Susannah to tell you about it.
So the paper I picked is a paper that was in the American Economic Review in 2023 called Populist Leaders and the Economy. And it showed that 15 years after a populist leader was instituted in a country, GDP fell by 10%. I think this is relevant to the discussion because we were talking about kind of this populism on the right, and we have a populist in office, and populism worldwide, whether it's right-wing populism or left-wing populism, has really real consequences for GDP, which then has really real consequences for families, for individuals, for economic growth, for innovation. And so I just think this paper is really important for people to read to kind of get why so many people are concerned about the rise of populism worldwide, that it isn't just a rhetoric issue, it's truly an economic one that will kind of change the world around us and the life we live day to day.
Populist Leaders and the Economy by Funke, Schularik, and Trebisch. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.